Why do you fret? It is now 6 o'clock, and I call this special meeting of the Commerce City Council to order. Item 2, discussion related to the city's water production and water distribution system issues during the February 2021 winter weather event.
Mayor, Council, howdy, Lisenby, City Manager. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight for this workshop. It's not our regularly scheduled meeting date, so I appreciate y'all's opening up your schedule to join us, and I think will be a productive time this evening. One of the things I wanted to touch on briefly, we've talked about this before, is just in general recap some of the things that happened specifically to our water system and the fact that we lost water pressure for a number of days and then went into a boil water notice. As we go back and look at the details of what happened and figure out what we did wrong, what we could do better, what we need to do to be ready for the next time this rolls around, we still have one more major conversation that we're going to have as a staff to take a look from an emergency management point of view, how we handled it and what we can do better. But there are a couple of key takeaways that I think is important to put in front of us as we talk about budgets and budgeting the process. The first key takeaway in my mind is the absence of a generator at the water treatment plant. We're not alone. Most water utilities in Texas don't have generators at their water treatment plants. I have not worked in a city that had a generator at a water treatment plant, and the mentality has always been kind of what really is the risk. Cities down along the coast that are impacted by hurricanes on a seasonal basis, they generally will have generators and have backup power. But Central Texas, West Texas, and even North and Northeast Texas, not as much, because the risk of a total power failure is generally pretty low. One of the other things that many communities will also do is that they'll have power provided to a treatment plant from two different substations. The risk of losing one substation is real. The risk of losing two entire substations is usually statistically not as great a risk. And so that usually is the standard that communities will use as power backup, is have two different substations that they use to feed their plant. In an event like happened this past month, a couple of weeks ago, we lost the entire grid and lost power for a significant portion of the state. And we were not alone in the loss of power and the being unprepared with generators. But one of the things that I've been telling my staff, and it was already their mentality anyway, is it's not good enough to be like everybody else. The fact that we're one of 1,000 water systems that lost power does not provide any comfort to us. We need to be better than everybody else. There are cities in East Texas that lost power. They had generators, and they kept providing water, and they didn't lose water pressure throughout that event. We need to be better than everybody else, not like everybody else. And so one of the key takeaways is going to be adding a generator and fuel storage. Our engineer, Hayter Engineering, is already looking at that. If you'll recall, y'all authorized a project at the water plant to the tune of about $1.5 million. We talked about that in December and then again in January. That project is already under design. They were already working on the treatment plant issues, and we've got a generator in the scope of that project so that whenever we finish design and move into construction, we should be able to acquire a generator that is appropriately sized for our plant, along with the fuel we would need, hopefully, to operate for 3 full days. That allows us to be prepared for potential risk that may happen. One of the other key takeaways is something that we had already talked about, again, in December and then in January. The capacity of our treatment plant to produce water on paper is 3 million gallons a day. In practice, because we had filters that were not online and were not working, we really could only produce 1 million, maybe 1.5 million. That's good enough when you have water in storage and your system is operating normally. When you drain a system and lose pressure, you then have to refill the system before you can establish pressure. And the capacity of our plant prior to the storm just was not great enough to recover from a situation like this. So the project that y'all authorized before the storm even happened would rehab all 6 filters and restore our full capacity back to 3 million gallons a day. We're already under design. We're already working on those issues. The storm hit us before we were ready. But you have a team of employees in the water department that have the creativity and have the tenacity to just keep working. And they found solutions and took parts that really don't even have anything to do with water treatment and created a way to increase our capacity. And at the end, we were treating 2.6 million gallons of water a day. And that's over double what our capacity had been prior to the storm. That allowed us to overcome demand and refill the system up at a much higher rate than we would have been without their creativity. But a learning point is a plant operating at capacity should always be a priority, and we were not operating at capacity, and it hurt us. The third takeaway is a little bit bigger conversation, and it will take some time. I think water storage needs to be a conversation that we have. Water storage happens in 2 places. Everybody's familiar with water towers. That's the elevated storage that lifts the water up in the air. For our community, we have about 1 million gallons of water stored up in the air. But water towers are not your supply storage. They're there to provide system pressure. And ground storage tanks is typically where you want to have, if you will, water on the shelf. Water that's already treated, water that's ready. We just have to push it into town. At our water treatment plant, our capacity is 300,000 gallons of stored water. And when your daily demand in the summer is around 1 million, 1.2 million, you don't have enough storage on the shelf, if you will, to make it through a day. So at some point, we're going to have some conversations about increasing the water storage that we have, meaning water that's already been through the plant, it's produced, it's on the shelf, if you will, ready to go. And so if we had a generator and we had water in storage, we would have never lost pressure, we would have never missed a beat, and we would have kept operating. And this businesses, the city would not have had any trouble. We're not there, and so we've still got some work to do. It's easy to thank God that the problem's over and the storm's behind us, but we still have a lot of work to do for our water system, and I want you to know you've got a team that you can have confidence in, that we're already looking at some of these issues before the storm hit. We just weren't ready for it, and that's a failure on our part, and we're going to be better next time. And so before we move on, do y'all have any questions related to the water system and what happened and what we're doing about it?
Go ahead.
I do. I've had several citizens ask about this. When did we get, at one point, we did have a generator. When did we get rid of that generator?
At the water treatment plant or at the wastewater plant? There is a generator at the wastewater plant that treats sewer. I'm not aware of a generator at the water treatment plant. I don't know that there's ever been one.
There were some things that came out that we had recently sold it, and just kind of like to clear that we didn't have that and recently sold it for any reason.
Yeah, so I'm not aware that there's not a footprint at the plant where a generator used to be, and there's really not even the wiring for a generator. We restored power, I can't remember what day it was, but when power came back on, it was around midnight. We never lost power again, but after power was restored, we were still able to find a generator that was brought in on a trailer, and so we set a generator up and had an electrician run the wiring that we needed. Should we lose power again, we were ready, but we had to go find a generator in another state, and somebody had to bring it to us in the middle of these icy conditions.
I just wanted to clear that up.
Yes, ma'am.
I didn't know the answer either. So.
Yeah.
Does the city have its own supply of diesel fuel?
We have some storage, and so we had enough diesel in our storage tanks to get us through for the generators that we had, and the county had made arrangements to back us up should we need extra diesel. One of the things that we ran out of, what we didn't have, is automobile and vehicle fuel. And so we were able to work with a couple of the vendors in town that closed early. They still had fuel in the tanks, but they stopped selling retail to the public so that emergency responders, fire trucks, ambulance, and police could have fuel. We don't have any fuel in our own storage tanks for our vehicles. but we did have a supply of diesel that we were able to hold back for generators.
Is our storage gravity feed?
I think at the service center it is gravity,
Okay.
but they had the ability to move some in the tanks and hook up a little portable pump so that they could move it around if they had to.
Well, we had a disaster preparation program here several years ago, and it was noted that at that time, and I assume it's the same now, there is no diesel fuel pump in this town connected to a generator at a retailer.
Yeah.
And we haven't needed it.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
it would be something to talk about
It would be.
as to when there is no power and there's fuel in the ground. It would be nice if a place like Brookshire's has diesel fuel and a generator for their freezers, but it's not hooked up to the fuel pumps.
It's one of those things that people don't think about until it's too late. Coming out of college, I was at a movie theater and we were watching a movie, and a storm blew through and knocked out the power. And so the movie shut down, and we're in the theater and we're in the dark, and they told us, hey, in about 15 minutes we'll have everything back on. Just sit still and we'll have the movie back on. So we all got up and went to the restroom. And none of the sinks worked, none of the toilets worked, nothing worked because it all needed power to start the little motion sensors. And you don't ever think about that until it's too late and you don't have any power. We've got to think about those things ahead of time and be ready for them, and that's what we're committed to do.
Okay. Any questions, other questions related to item 2? Item 3, recognition of city employees related to high performance for the duration of the February 2021 winter weather event.
Mayor, Council, this is a conversation that I believe some of y'all requested to be on the agenda, and it's something that we had already been giving some thought to. From my experience, I've been in public service for about 20 years. This was not my first rodeo. I've been through not this exact scenario, but I've been through disaster situations before. And one of the things that I've always seen after it's over, the disaster hits and your staff, it's like there's a jolt of adrenaline, and everybody jumps in and everybody's on board and everybody is committed to doing whatever they have to do to make sure we make it through and serve the community. The event's over, we're on the other side, and the adrenaline kind of flushes out of your system. And in my experience, that's when the employer starts nickel and diming everybody about how much time they worked and how can we avoid overtime. And there's this whole letdown after the storm, if you will. And staff do not appreciate that. It's very demoralizing when they go through a situation like that. And then the next time you have a disaster, they think twice about how hard they're really going to work. And years ago, I made myself that promise we all made. When I'm a parent, I'm not going to do that to my kid, right? And I'd always decided I didn't want that to be the experience in an organization that I was helping lead. And so one of the things that we've done is we're putting together, we already have basically an inclement weather policy so that if it snows and you can't safely get to work and we shut down City Hall, we already have a policy that talks about how you get paid if you don't get to come to work. We already have that. We didn't have a real clear policy on what do you do in the middle of a disaster when people come in and they're working in really bad conditions and they're working incredibly long hours. And so what we're doing is from February the 11th through the 21st, it's a 10-day window that we really were in emergency and disaster mode. We have members of our team that stayed home. It's not meant to be derogatory, but there are non-essential services that it's not worth them taking the risk to get out on the road and damage their vehicles or take their life in their own hands. Then there are essential services like water, like police, like fire, those things that have to keep operating, and they did. And so in that 10-day window that we were in disaster mode, every hour worked will be compensated at time and a half. And we're not counting 40 hours. We're not counting whether they qualify for overtime or not. If they worked hours in that 10-day window, every hour they worked is paid at time and a half, to recognize the effort they put in and the fact that they had to work in some very adverse conditions. We also had, and that's fantastic for your non-exempt or your hourly employees. You then also typically have exempt and salaried employees, such as Chief Bassam, that put in an incredible amount of hours working around the clock with very little sleep, pulling resources from everywhere. They don't get paid by the hour, and so we typically don't track their time in that way. So between the 11th and the 21st, there's a handful of exempt employees that put in a tremendous amount of effort that was very beneficial to our community. We went back and tracked their time. We don't really track comp time and comp hours for our exempt staff, but during this emergency situation, we calculated what their comp hours were, and we're not banking that so they can take them off in the future, because they don't take off the time they have now anyway. So it really doesn't do them any good to say, congratulations, here's 10 more days that you can never take off again. And so in that 10-day window, we calculated what their comp time hours were, and then we buy those hours from them, and we buy off that comp time balance. It's just for the duration of some kind of disaster or emergency situation, but it recognizes the effort and the energy that they expended on behalf of our community. And yes, there's a price tag, but I think the work they did was priceless. And so we have no hesitation making sure that we take care of them, because they did take care of us. Not to go all biblical, but there is a passage that says, don't muzzle the ox that threshes the wheat. They're working really hard for our community, and I think it needs to be recognized. And so that's how we're handling pay for those employees during that time period that went above and beyond and worked for our community in the middle of some very inhospitable conditions. Beyond that, one of the things that we're talking about trying to do, most of these employees really don't want to be visible. Most of them really don't want to be recognized in front of the public, but we're going to go and take pictures of some of these teams and make sure they're on the website so that people can put a face to a name and see the staff that really put in the effort to make sure this community was served as best as we could under the conditions. Anything beyond that, we've had a couple of restaurants offer to cater and bring food, and we're allowing things like that to happen. But that so far is the extent of what we've been doing to recognize the staff that has served this community, and I think served them well. So,
Well, I think it's an excellent example of what we need to do for our employees. And I understand that they may not need to want their faces out there, but we have had several people that have approached members of this council that says they want to do something above and beyond and recognize these people and their family.
Yeah.
Because not only did they do their job because they were supposed to do their job, they left their families having to go through the same thing we did.
Right.
And we would like to, and this is more from a community, not from the council doing it, but we'll help to lead the initiative, that we would like to be able to have a city employee recognition, not at a council meeting, not in anything like that, but to have a very special meeting for them and have them for the city to come in and be able to meet them and have their families here if they'd like.
I would only ask that if we do it, that we do it probably during the day and what would be their normal work hours, rather than ask them to come back after work to participate in something like that. But we're more than happy to help facilitate that.
I'm curious, how many hours did Chief Basham work?
184? I think in that 10-day period it was 184 hours. And at one point, Joe Davis, who came out of retirement to come back to work for us on a part-time basis, worked for 24 hours straight with no break.
Wow.
And I kind of got onto him and made him go home and get some rest. He would have just kept going. He's incredibly dedicated, and he is a machine. But we made them take a break and get some rest. So
And that's kind of the example. I didn't know that. We didn't know that, so.
No. And they're okay if no one ever
I
knows
know.
that, but we're going to recognize them.
Other questions or comments?
I was proud of our employees,
Mm-hmm.
without a doubt.
Well,
I agree.
We had wonderful things happen in a terrible situation, and that is rewarding. So we do need to figure out a way for the community to say thank you, because I know they appreciate it. Okay, item 4, discussion related to preparation of the fiscal year 2022 budget, including an overview of the process, goal setting for the fiscal year, the city's current and projected financial condition, the budget calendar, and other budgetary related items.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. I think has been y'all's practice, and it's something that I have always endeavored to do, is that at the very beginning of a budget process, have a meeting with the legislative body so that we can find out what are some of the priorities and some of the projects that y'all would really like to see in an upcoming budget conversation. I never want to be Moses for many, many reasons. But I don't feel like staff, it's not our job to go up on the mountain and have a meeting with God and then come back and tell you and the community, here's what you get. I don't like that approach. And rather instead, I feel our role is, to use a nautical example, we're more like the navigators of the boat. Somebody else says, this is the destination, this is where we want the boat to go, and then it's our job to figure out the best, most efficient way to get it there. And so if we as a staff try to figure out where the boat needs to go and how to get there, I think it loses the ability for the community to have a voice and who the community wants to be and what the community wants to prioritize. And so I think that is some of the back and forth conversation that we have throughout this process. Jamie will tell you that we never actually stop the budget process. So it's not like we're really starting. We're in the budget process every day of the year. But this recognizes that we're starting a conversation about next fiscal year that will begin in October of 2021. And the state law has a very clear calendar that you work backwards from to figure out what your milestones are, and we'll get into some of those dates. But my goal tonight is not take an incredibly long amount of time, but I want to make sure we commit the time necessary to identifying what are those priorities, what are those goals that you want to see in the budget that we draft for you to review later this year. And so this presentation is really to just kind of lead us into that conversation. On the roadmap in front of us, the first square, we work from left to right because the mayor's left-handed and it works better that way. Budget process, we'll talk strategic plan. We'll take a look at what our current financial condition is so that we've got some context to this conversation. Where I really want us to do our work and earn our money, if you will, is in the square where it talks about big rocks, and then we'll wrap up and conclude. So I'm going to start working through this. At any point in time, if you have questions, speak up, stop me. I will remind everybody to speak into your mic so that we can capture it for those that are watching via YouTube or watching it later when we play the recording back. So, budget process, I always want to make sure that we're managing expectations. I don't want to be headed to Paris, Texas and think that we're going right where we need to go and y'all all thought we wanted to go to Greenville and I find out I'm going in the completely wrong direction. So managing expectation and making sure we're all heading in the direction we think we're supposed to be heading. And I will share with you a new inside joke amongst your staff on this slide. Jamie and I are the numbers people, not the words people. And so we rely heavily on our illustrious City Secretary and Director of Administrative Services, Molly. When I first put this together, I was thinking whose budget is WHO apostrophe S, because that is the possessive phrase of whose is it? And she was like, no, it's WHOSE. And I just kind of looked at her like, what are you talking about? Whose is it? There should be an apostrophe S there. She was right, I was wrong, and so now we go around saying, who is budget? So y'all now have knowledge into the inside joke. For us, the process looks something like this. We have tonight's kickoff meeting where we get some feedback from you about your priorities and the projects you would like to see. From here, our next steps are each department is going to submit requests for what they think needs to be their operations and any equipment, what are the expenditures they anticipate in the next fiscal year. And so there's a period of time where the department heads take a look at their operations, figure out what their budget requests are going to be, and they turn all of those in to Ms. Jamie in finance. At that point, it becomes the finance budget. And she works her magic and puts the numbers together in a way that makes sense to all of us. And then after they've done their work, they bring it to me, and it becomes my budget. I don't want it to seem like I am not involved throughout this process, but I've found that if the city manager sits in every one of those meetings, the department heads don't really ask for the things they really think they need. And so if Jamie and the department head have some of those meetings without me, they'll probably have a more free and a more productive conversation. Once it becomes my budget, I'm going to take a look at it and figure out how much is too much and what we need to try to compress down so that we're efficient and using the public dollars wisely. We are committed and by state law required to bring you a balanced budget. And so as we get through the calendar, I will bring what is my budget to you that is a balanced proposed budget. Then it becomes yours and y'all's budget, and you will have it for a period of time that you get to look it over, you get to digest it, you get to ask questions, and then if you as a council want to shift some things around, that's your prerogative, because at that point it's your budget. And then finally we adopt it and it becomes the community's budget, and it is what we live by. And so that's kind of the process that we'll walk through as we move forward over the coming months. Next, I want to shift gears just a little bit. I don't think that you can ever budget one individual year. You have to be looking at a bigger picture of where you want to go. If you try to just budget this year in isolation and ignore the past years, or you ignore the future years, you end up spending a lot of wheels and a lot of effort and never getting anywhere. And so this leads to the conversation about the comprehensive plan. We had a comprehensive plan. From what we can tell, it was written in 2002 and was set to expire in 2020. It's 2021 and the plan has dated itself. And so I think we need to, in this coming year, and we've talked about this, update or renew our comprehensive plan. So on that note, we never want to budget in a vacuum. We always need to be looking at the bigger picture of who we want to be when we grow up, and does this budget help us get to that destination? And so whatever that future is that our community believes in and wants, this year's budget needs to move us very demonstratively in that direction. If it doesn't, we're not being good stewards of the public's money. Beyond that, we actually have, there's probably more than two, but I think there are two very viable options in front of us right now for updating our comprehensive plan. The Community Development Block Grant has a program that this community qualifies for. It's a program I've done in a couple of different cities, and so we're qualified for a $65,000 grant, at which we would have to match 20% of the funding. So that's approximately $13,000 that we would have to come up with to match that planning process. In your binder behind tab 1, there is some supporting documents if you want to look at those now or later. But they're on page 2 through 12 of that packet is some information about this comprehensive planning grant that we actually qualify for. GrantWorks is the organization that would help us put the application together. It's due in August, and that process would allow us to go through a full comprehensive planning program and would result in a comprehensive document that this community can buy into. The other option, and we've talked about this some, is Texas A&M down in College Station. They have a program called Texas Target Communities, in which small communities that meet some economic criteria can apply. If your community is chosen, then the university, their students, their programs come in and lead you through a planning process. Two downsides to that is the end result is not as comprehensive as what you get through the Community Development Block Grant, and it wouldn't cost a lot, but it would cost more than $13,000. And so I would recommend that we pursue the Community Development Block Grant comprehensive plan process, because we get a more complete report and we actually spend a little bit less money. But if there is some reason or commitment to try to partner with Texas A&M, that would also be valid. But it's my recommendation to get more report for less money. I'm just backwards that way. So unless y'all have some kind of heartburn, that's the route I would like to and would choose to go, is work with GrantWorks to get the Community Development Block Grant project going. So if there's any questions or feedback, that's the direction I would like to move.
Is that something we need to vote on, or just?
No, there's no need for action today. Our cost is less than $50,000. It didn't have to come to the council, but it's a policy and a political question. I just would, if anybody has heartburn, speak now or forever hold your peace, because that's the direction we would like to go as your staff.
I concur.
Okay. All right. Interestingly, we were going through one of our old rooms, and this is actually a sign from 2006 that the city council set as their goals for the community. And so I have them on the screen, and you can enjoy the sign as it goes by. But some of these are going to sound familiar. In 2006, it was important to this community to develop a viable street program. It was important to establish cooperative efforts between the university, the school district, and the county. They wanted to identify infrastructure issues and identify solutions. They wanted to market the city, develop civic pride. They wanted to look at the basic services that we provide, and they wanted to redevelop downtown. I don't know that a lot has changed from 2006 to 2021. Those still remain some issues and some priorities that we're willing to take a look at. So as we go through tonight's discussion, we'll come back and visit some of these questions and some of these issues. But ultimately, my goal tonight, and as you'll see on the board that Vanna White Molly prepared for us, is we're going to look at 5 different areas of service that we provide to the community. Public safety, which includes police, fire, and animal control, and there may be some priorities or some projects that you would like to see in the coming budget or in the coming years. We're going to talk about public infrastructure, which includes streets, water, and wastewater. We'll talk about, I call it general welfare. It may not be the best name for that category. We call it community services up on the board, but there are priorities and projects for Parks and Rec, for community development, and for economic development. Then we'll talk about public administration. That is a matter of policy. If there's any legislative issues that we want to try to promote, or if there's organizational leadership that you want to see or feel we need to focus on. And then finally, public finance. Jamie was afraid that I thought that finance was broken and this was our way to fix it. That is not the case. But every year during budget, I think it is very valuable for you and us to have a conversation about your goals, specifically about fund balance. How much should we keep? How should we treat it? And we'll have that in just a little bit. We need to talk about CIP as capital improvements plan. If all you ever do is budget for operations and you never think about the large capital expenditures, you look up in 2021 and have an ice storm that completely takes your water treatment plant down because you didn't have capital investment as part of your conversation. And then rate objectives, we'll talk about that a little bit as well. As a policy, what do you want to see with tax rates? What do you want to see with water and sewer utility rates? Those things like that. So that's kind of where we're going to try to focus as we go through this meeting tonight. And so I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about our current and past financial condition so that we have some context. If you don't look at where you are financially right now, it's real easy to have a planning conversation about all of the great things we should and need to do and never bother with the resources required. I was not involved in the planning process, but I was a victim of a planning process one time in a community where we owned a lake, a reservoir that we used for drinking water purposes. And in West Texas, the idea of a constant level lake in West Texas is ludicrous, to say the least. And this planning organization, they developed and paid for a fully fleshed out plan that would create this gorgeous residential development with $200,000 homes all around this lake that would just become this amazing attraction. All they needed was a constant level lake. That's kind of a big issue when you're talking about whether this is a realistic goal. And so we're not asking for a constant level lake, but we do need to keep in mind the resources we have to use in solving some of the problems that are in front of us. So one of the things that you look at is your fund balance. Some of the reason fund balance is important is because it provides operational stability. When you have some money in the bank, it provides some stability for your operations because you know when something happens, you have a way to pay for those unknowns. An example would be, I'm not using it as a shining example, but we just had major system failures in 9 heaters across public facilities. We can announce that as of today, the library is open and has heat, and that system is working famously, and they're very thankful for that. But that was a very real operational issue where we closed the library to the public and the staff couldn't even work in there because of how cold it was. We had a healthy fund balance. We had some money available. It wasn't planned, it wasn't anticipated, but we were able to respond to that issue at the library, here at City Hall, and at the fire department because we were carrying some healthy fund balances. So there's a very real reason to protect and maintain those fund balances for operational issues, as well as emergency response. You can look at rate stabilization. That's usually a utility fund concept, but if you carry a healthy fund balance and you plan your water and sewer rates appropriately, as business cycles and seasonal things happen, some years are going to be wet and you won't sell much water. Some years are going to be dry and you're going to sell a crazy amount of water, and the revenues can fluctuate. You don't want to be reacting to every one of those fluctuations from your business processes, and so having a healthy fund balance provides that stability. And finally, investor confidence. You will see in a minute that when we go out and get a bond rating this year, we maintained our A+, which I think is very commendable for our community. Investors have the warm fuzzies when a community has healthy fund balances and they demonstrate an ability to protect those fund balances. Council sets policy as to what that target fund balance is going to be. Our target currently sits at 90 days of operations, so you take whatever your expense budget is times 25%. That's usually how much fund balance is considered healthy. And so as we look at some of our funds, this is what happens. This is what has happened fiscal year 15 through fiscal year 19. We're in the middle of our audit for fiscal year 20, so we don't have audited numbers. But in fiscal 15, we had 192 days of fund balance. 16, that dropped to 175, then down to 163, then down to 109, and then it built back up to 113. I believe it is our estimation that that is going to grow again in the fiscal 20 audit, but we're on the tail end of having that audit report done. So general fund has a healthy fund balance. Too much fund balance can be just as bad as not enough fund balance. So the fact that we went from 192 down to 109 days does not cause me heartburn. I wasn't here, but I would imagine that's probably some kind of investment in infrastructure or some kind of investment in some program that needed to use those dollars. As long as you stay above 90, that's considered to be healthy. Water fund is a little bit of a different story. I'll let Jamie speak to this to some degree, but in fiscal 15, at the end of that period, we had 59 days of fund balance in the utility. That's not considered healthy. The following year, total fund balance increased, but the unrestricted was still only 60 days. The part of that column in red means there's money in the bank, but it's restricted and has a specific name on it, and so it's not available to be used for operations. So the following year, kind of the same situation. We had a fairly large restricted fund balance, and we had 53 days of unrestricted. The next year, some accounting rules changed. Some things happened with some of the debt that had been paid off or that was outstanding and refinanced. And so how the auditors calculate this changed. And so we were able to jump up to 116 days. Fiscal 19 was 125 days. So the utility fund is becoming more healthy in the fund balance that it's carrying. Jamie, did you have any thoughts about that?
So I'll just say
See? You should have let me do it. She's finance, not IT. It's okay.
what I'll say is you see that direct correlation between the general fund and the water sewer fund. And if you remember a few years ago, there was a goal to start decreasing the supplement that's coming from water and sewer over. So even though we weren't able to get rid of it, we did, lessen it, and you see that effect in there. The other thing on the general fund is due to us trying to bring up our employees to a pay that is more substantial and more livable, you see that drop in fund balance because we made that choice to put our employees up. That's going to be your main two differences. And then, and I'll let you know, so the unrestricted and the restricted, so if you remember, some of you were probably on the council still, is in 2017 we did a refinancing bond, and it refinanced the 2003 bond, and so those funds were no longer restricted, and they moved from current to long term. And also Texas Water Board funds, once we stopped using that money, even though next year or in this fiscal year we're now utilizing it, the auditors then say, okay, it's stagnant, it's not current, it's long term, so it's no longer restricted. So that's where you see those two big differences.
On the next slide, Howdy,
The one for the general fund?
yes.
Okay.
Okay, what is the restricted fund in the
So the restricted fund here is, we actually have two restricted funds. Oh, the batteries. So we actually have two restricted funds. The first one is some funds that at some point was allocated to streets. We have not been utilizing those funds. So what we did was to pay for the street survey, we lowered some of those restricted funds out of your fund balance because it was allocated to streets. At 2019 and again in 20, we did see a large increase in seizure funds in getting money.
You'll also see behind tab 1, page 15 is written in blue in the bottom right-hand corner. There is a copy of a balance sheet from the fiscal 19 audit, and that's where many of these numbers come from. And so first column of the general fund, very, very bottom, unassigned fund balance was $1,509,663, and then above that is $170,000 that was assigned to streets. So once you put a name on there, it becomes restricted and can't be used for other purposes. And so specifically for fiscal 19, we had a balance of money that was set aside and designated for streets, and so it's reflected in what can be done with those funds.
And that's something that is done within a council meeting, and kind of like what we did with the animal shelter funds. And we specifically said we are putting these funds aside for this specific use. So then it just kind of holds it in its own little envelope, and it doesn't go into our, I can use it on my electricity bill kind of pocket.
Good question. All right. After we talk fund balance, I think it's beneficial to talk a little bit about past budgets and how you performed to see if there are trends. And so we're going to just take a quick look at general fund and utility fund. I'll warn you, this next slide is a little overwhelming, but we'll get through it. Fiscal year 15 through fiscal year 20, these were the budgets that were adopted. And so if you look at some of the color coding and the numbers that we put in there, bottom of each one of those bars in dark blue was administration. That was city administration, city council, governmental affairs. There's a lot of overhead expenses, if you will, that are included in that category. And across that 5-year period, it went from 17% of the budget to 18% of the budget to 19% of the budget to 21% of the budget to 22% of the budget, and then back down to 21% of the budget. So over a 5-year period of time, there's not a whole lot of movement, but you see a trend in which administrative costs and overhead are starting to grow. That's one of the reasons why you'll recall we had a conversation shortly after I joined the team. We had some administrative, executive level positions within the organization that were vacant, that had been funded. And we decided to defund those positions and use those savings to raise wages for the entry level and the field workers, because an organization our size didn't necessarily feel like we needed that much executive overhead for the operations that we have right now. And until our community and our base grows enough to support it, I felt like those funds would better be used to spread across the rest of that bar to help us recruit and retain quality employees at the field level. So those are some of the things you look at when you're talking about how budget trends change over time. Community development, parks and recreation have really not moved much over the past 5 years. Economic development has not moved at all. It's 1% all the way across the board, so I didn't even put those numbers in. But then you start looking at fire in the light blue. Went from 24% of the budget in FY15 to 19% of the budget in fiscal 20. Some of that is reallocation of how they took Chief Bassam and spread him across 2 different departments. But it also demonstrates that as a percentage of the total budget, fire has actually dropped over the last 5 years. Police department ultimately has held pretty consistent, around 30% over those 5 years. A slight swell in the middle, but we're back in line. And then finally, public works, which is streets, went from 9 to 8% in the last 2 years, was 13% of the budget. So there was some increased focus on streets and street operations in the past 2 budgets that have been adopted by the council. The red bar simply means where did our actual expenditures end up at the end of that budget period. So in fiscal 15, you'll see the red line comes in a little bit higher than the adopted budget, In each of the subsequent years, we come in at or under what the budget was that was adopted. I really like red lines that sit at the top of those bars. I really don't like red lines that are underneath the top of those bars, because in one hand that means we made a commitment to the community that these are the things we're going to do, and then we didn't do all of them. And so to some degree I think that is an indictment on us, and there's some accountability on our end that if we tell the community this is what we're going to do and then we don't do it, why would the community trust us with more dollars in the future? And so I think it's important to look at things like that. So
Is this percentage breakdown, in your experience, is that pretty much in line with other cities as far?
yes, ma'am. It's very consistent in what I've seen in most of the communities that I've served or that I'm aware of. Everybody jokes about police and fire because they typically are 50 to 60% of a general fund budget. And everybody jokes about how they get everything. But I'll remind everybody, in the middle of the February 2021 ice storm, police and fire were the ones that we counted on the most out of our general fund operations. It's not a slight to Parks and Recreation. Parks and Recreation is a viable part of a healthy community. But in an emergency, no one's going to the playground to look at the swings. They're responding to an emergency. And so there are critical services that we provide, and there's a reason why they're typically funded at those levels. Moving.
So on the year FY 19 and 20, and we were under, is that because we had positions that were sitting open, or why?
So, vacant positions, was a large part of that, but at the same time, we took the conservative approach to budgeting, where we tried to be more conservative with the hope that we would finish lower.
I think it'd be interesting to see in 19 and 20 which areas took what hits to end up with that lower than expected expense.
Sure.
Just for our information.
We can take a look at that. Moving on to the utility budget, similar layout, a little easier to read because you only have 4 areas to operate in the utilities. Water production, which is another word for water treatment, and then water distribution, then there's sewer collection, and there's sewer treatment. And so across the past 5 years of budgets, water production, water treatment has been about 50%, but in the previous 2 years, that number has started to decline. And so that begs the question, what changed or what were we doing differently? And so one of the good things about statistics is you can paint a really good picture. One of the bad things about statistics is you can paint any picture you want. And so it's easy to look at. We went from 51% to 41%. Why the drop? Well, if relatively the blue bar didn't change. So it's not like we reduced how much we funded water production. We actually increased how we funded water distribution and sewer collection. So that will start to skew the numbers a little bit. So water distribution went from 11% to 14%, sewer collection from 10 to 14%, and then wastewater treatment went from 28 to 31%. Not a lot of change across that time period. But to me, it speaks of and sends a message that we began to increase the amount of attention we pay and the resources we allocate to the infrastructure under the ground within our community, which is vital. You'll also see the red bar here, 15, 16, 17, and 18. The red bar comes in quite a bit under what was budgeted. 19 and 20 is closer to the top, which is, in my point of view, again, you want to kind of hit to where you said you were going to be and what you said you were going to do.
And how when it does come under the budget amount, does that money go? Where does that money go at that point? Is it just back to the fund balance and start over the next? Okay.
Assuming, again, the vertical bar is a budget that was adopted. I've been in communities that we had a budget that was adopted, and then it was an incredibly wet, rainy year in West Texas. When it's really, really wet and rainy in West Texas, nobody uses water. And so revenues drop. And the prudent thing to do then is to cut expenses to the same amount. So there are situations where the red line would come in because revenues came in underneath and you adjusted. This is only looking at an expense budget. And so keep in mind, sometimes there's a reason why, especially in utilities. If you take a big cut in revenues, you should reduce your planned expenditures around the same amount or greater so that you don't drain fund balance. And so that has happened in some communities as well. Last couple of points here. I think it is important to note that we have had a number of years with clean audit reports that had no significant findings. I think it's also important to note that that phenomenon aligns with when Ms. Jamie joined the team here. And so you have an incredible finance director that has helped turn the financial reporting and integrity of this community around. And when you have clean audit reports, that gives investors, and it should give the members of the community, confidence in the financial management of the organization. And then finally, if you go after bond ratings, there is usually some very good feedback from those rating agencies. As mentioned, we just went through a ratings review with Standards & Poor, and we were able to maintain an A+ rating in what is considered a very volatile municipal debt market right now. A lot of investors are moving away from municipal debt because of how volatile it is at the local economy level. We maintained our A+ rating. Some of the reasons for that, I told Jamie I've never been so happy to be called adequate in my life. But we have an adequate economy in Commerce, and I think one of the reasons we were able to say that is that many communities across Texas, as a result of COVID, seeing huge dives of sales tax receipts as a response to COVID. Our sales tax has held steady and held constant and even grown a little bit through this COVID pandemic, which is not what most communities have experienced. And so that helped us maintain a good economy from the rating agency point of view. Adequate management and adequate budgetary performance. They felt like there was enough evidence that this organization is being managed and handling the finances responsibly. They felt there was very strong budgetary flexibility. A lot of that comes from conversations Ms. Jamie had with the rating agency about how we are quick to respond to changes when we have a projection and we don't hit that projection. We respond and don't spend money that we thought we would have spent. And that flexibility to react quickly resonated very strongly with the rating agency. Very strong liquidity usually talks about your cash position and how much cash you carry in relation to your annual expenditures. We have healthy fund balances that equates to strong liquidity. Investors really like that. Next bullet point we're going to talk a little bit about, very weak debt and contingent liability profile. But then they also felt there was strong institutional framework. That primarily has to do with the fact that we're in Texas. When they look at the municipal bond market across the nation, there are some states that investors have more confidence in than others, and most investors feel very strong about Texas and the economy in Texas, and so they're more willing to invest in municipal bonds because of the framework that exists in Texas. But I want to talk a little bit about the one very weak that we got from the bond rating agency because it provides some important context to our conversation. Total annual debt service, that's the total check you write every year to pay on debt, represents 10.1% of the general fund budget. That 10% of the general fund budget can be alarming to investors. There is an asterisk to add there, though, is that much of our debt is actually utility system debt that's paid for by water and sewer. But one of the debt instruments that gets used in Texas, which we just did, is a certificate of obligation. One of the things they'll say is they'll call it a double barrel pledge. It's like you have a cosigner on your loan. The water utility is borrowing the money. The water utility is saying that we're going to pay the money back with revenues generated from the water utility. But just in case Dad co-signs on the loan, and that's the general fund, so that if something fell off the wagon in water, there would be a property tax support to help pay for that debt. I'm not aware of any communities that have had to actually exercise that co-signer option, but the fact that it's there drops your interest rate and makes investors feel there's less risk, and so it's cheaper to borrow money through a certificate of obligation rather than a pure revenue bond where it's just the water system alone. And so Commerce traditionally has issued certificates of obligation, which have that double pledge of water system revenue and tax if we needed it. And therefore the auditors or the rating agency says, well, what's this total debt service as part of general fund if the general fund has to step up and take over? And right now that annual debt service would be 10% of our budget. They feel like that is an exposure that starts to make them a little nervous. Next step of that is the total debt principal for all of the debt that's outstanding is 206% of the general fund budget. That's the total principal of what has been borrowed by this community, only compared to the annual general fund budget. It doesn't take into account the water fund, those budgets, those assets, because it's looking at a worst case scenario. If the water fund were to default on this and Dad as the co-signer had to step up and pay, what happens? That's the debt profile they're looking at, and that's why they say it's very weak for our community. And so that's something that we've got to keep in mind as we look to the future to some of the capital investment that this community needs, and how do we finance it and how do we fund it? Because if we keep adding to certificates of obligation and these numbers keep changing, at some point it's going to overtake the good economy and the good management and the good liquidity, and your A+ rating will drop to an A or it'll drop to a B. And when your rating starts sliding, the interest rate on your debt goes up significantly. And so the issue we just did for some of our water system and our street improvements, we came in at a 1.4% interest rate, which is phenomenal. If the bond rating starts slipping down, that 1.4% is going to start moving up, and that makes it more expensive to do the things that this community needs. So as we budget and as we talk about projects, we have to keep in mind the resources we have and how we pay for those projects. And that's an important point of context that I think we need to be thinking about. So on that note, we talked about this a little bit throughout the night. We don't have a whole lot more time, but fund balance goals, capital improvement programs, and your rate objectives, you need to keep thinking about that as well. So before we jump into the Big Rocks conversation, do y'all have any questions of anything we've covered so far? Okay. Is everybody familiar with the phrase or the concept of big rocks? Just a very quick Cliff's Notes summary. Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, is where I learned of the concept. And the picture kind of, in a simple way, demonstrates what the idea and the concept is the glass or the bucket or the container represents your capacity to get things done, whether it's time or whether it's money or whatever your resource constraints are. The bucket is what you're limited to. You cannot do more than the bucket can hold. And then in front of the bucket, you have a pile of rocks and some gravel and some sand. And the size of the object relates to its importance. Big rocks should be really important. Sand is immaterial or inconsequential. And if you pour all the sand in first and then you put the small gravel in, much of the capacity of your container is used up, and then you can't get all the rocks in there. And so the really big important things that you wanted to do remain undone because you didn't prioritize correctly. And conversely, if you put the big rocks in first, then pour in some gravel, and then pour in some sand, you don't get all of the sand done. But that's okay because it's sand. And so the things that are left undone are the more minor things that aren't as consequential. And so when you talk about big rocks, what are those priorities? What are those things that we want to focus on and try to make sure we get in the bucket first before we look at gravel and sand? So that's the idea. And so we're going to talk some about priorities, projects, and then we'll look at some of your answers to the council survey. When I talk about priorities, what I'm looking for is, in general, areas that you want us to focus on in terms of our operation. Normal operations is the staff time, the staff efforts, the normal materials, the things we do in our day-to-day operations. If there are priorities you want us to focus those operations on as we write our budget and plan what our work's going to be in this fiscal period, it helps us focus our staff and focus our efforts. So some examples could be talking about streets and infrastructure. Maybe you want a common sense plan that can be easily presented to the community to improve how the public moves within the city. That begins to give us some operational focus that you want a deliverable from us that is a plan that makes sense, that can be communicated to the city and to the citizens, that makes sense about how we want to address traffic and how it moves across the community. That helps us focus staff. Conversely, you could say, we really want you to focus on potholes. Well, then that shifts how we use our staff and how we allocate our resources to focus on that area of streets. We want to make sure we're pointed in the direction you want us to be pointed in when we go to work. Another example for public safety, there may be a trend within community crime statistics that you find troubling or that you're hearing from the community about. Maybe there's a lot of people running stop signs on Live Oak, and that's feedback that we get a lot, and so it becomes a priority. We can start focusing our staff in and looking at how we use our resources to try to address that operational issue. Finally, public utilities example could be a rate strategy that provides for operations and capital investment in our aging infrastructure. That kind of helps us focus the operational side of our budget. Then we'll talk a little bit about projects. Projects are different than priorities. And by that, I mean a project is a very unique scope of work that is defined by time, resource, and deliverable constraints. So operations means every day we show up to work, these are the things we focus on, these are the things that we do. A project is very defined in scope, defined in time, and defined in the resources that are used for that project. Go do X. That's a project rather than an operation. A project is intended to improve or replace something that is existing or to create something that's new. I talk to my staff a lot about we need to be better next month than we are this month. Well, the only way you get better is by doing a project. And so maybe we have a procedure that we're not comfortable with how that procedure works. Well, then we need to define a scope of work that somebody is going to take the responsibility to look at that process, research it, rewrite it, and come back with a better process. That's a defined scope of work. That's a project that we take on to make an improvement here. Finally, the project should align with your strategic plan or your council priorities. If you say we want priority to be potholes and we want to improve the presence of potholes, and that's the priority you want for our operations, and then we put a project together that buys a brand new sign for the entrance of the community. The project doesn't align with the priorities you said you want us to focus on. And so we want to try to make sure those are all in alignment. And then finally, we sent out a survey that y'all were able to provide some responses for. So I want to just capture this feedback quickly. We asked the question, what city accomplishments are you most proud of during your time on the council? A detailed budget, which allows us to better determine what we can and cannot do. Stabilization of personnel and finances. We have many projects going that I'm proud of, but the one that has been brewing for a while is the work that's in progress at the airport. Big thumbs up for getting that ball rolling. The comment, financial integrity and transparency. And then someone wrote a paragraph, I'm proud of our city council for hiring a city manager that understands the importance of building good relationships with our citizens, staff, and the university. Whoever wrote that, I'll pay you later. In the past 4 months, we've seen several stalled projects move forward. The fuel farm, design for Hunt County Road project, the wastewater treatment plant, and building relationships with some of our more difficult property owners. So that was some of the feedback to that question. Next question we asked, if you could fix one thing in the city, what would it be? Streets. Increase the economic base. Increase revenue. We need to develop a short-term and a long-term master plan for the city with the top priority of funding streets and infrastructure. And then there's a comment, Parks and Recreation Department, and a few of the EDC-B. I'm assuming that's the conversation of moving from a Type A to a Type B development corporation. Next question we asked, in your opinion, what would most improve the quality of life in Commerce? Detailed plans for the City Council and staff to work from. For our youth, a robust Parks and Recreation program. In general, improved streets and infrastructure will lead to economic development, which will stimulate other growth opportunities in Commerce. Affordable housing and more retail opportunities to create the shop local feeling. This will draw more investment. Someone said improve infrastructure, and somebody else cheated off of your paper and said infrastructure improvements. So we know that some of y'all were in collaboration in how you filled out this survey. For budget purposes, we are continuing the trend of declining revenue from hotel occupancy tax, or HOT receipts. This would limit new revenues to approximately $15,000, and we have approximately $20,000 in available fund balance. How would you prefer to allocate those HOT funds? One person said they would prorate the new revenue and the fund balance and spread it among the approved applicants. 4 of you said you would only prorate the new revenue among approved applicants. Next question we asked, this was a new one that I threw out there and turned into be somewhat of a curveball. If you were given $100, how would you allocate it, or how would you spend it across these 4 general fund categories? Public safety, streets, park and recreation, or community development. The average of your all responses would spend about $40 on public safety. You'd spend about $37 on streets. You'd spend a little bit on parks and recreation and a little bit on community development. The purpose of this question was not for you to tell me how to write a budget, but if we end up in a scenario, let's do a rain dance, where we have some new revenue come in, or we have some additional resources that are added to the budget. If we get an extra $100 that we didn't have before, do you want to spend all $100 on the police department, or how would you want to spread that around? It gives us a sense of what your priorities are for our operations. And as expected, public safety and streets infrastructure is a very high priority on all of y'all's list. You didn't ignore the quality of life issues of community development and parks and recreation, but safety and infrastructure remain a very high priority for this council moving forward. And we could have predicted it, but it's good to see the numbers come in that way. If you could create one new staff position and give it to which of the following departments? 2 of you said you would add that one position to public safety. 1 of you said streets. 1 of you said parks and recreation, and nobody would give that employee to community development. So they went and cried in the corner. The last question that we asked was really listing the departments and the areas of service that we provide to the community. This screen's kind of hard to read, but there is a printout that provides a little bit better visibility into it. But from your estimation, rate how strong or weak you feel these departments are. And the message that this sends to me, and it sends to our staff, is if you look at where the council feels the weakness is located, most of that is in community development, which is in planning and zoning, building permits and inspections, and code enforcement. That seems to be where most of the council felt our weakness is located in the operations and the services we provide this community. I do want to point out an interesting paradox. The majority of the council feels community development is the weakest, but no one listed that as a priority for us to focus on in coming years. And so the point of this is to say, in the level of service we provide this community, where we feel there's an area of weakness, is there a commitment to resources to try to help make those departments operate at a higher level? And that's kind of what we were fishing for, if you will. Y'all seem to be very confident in finance, in police, in fire, and the water and the wastewater utility. Probably some of you would change your answers if you could answer it after the storm event rather than before the storm event, because it turned out we had some very real challenges in water and wastewater coming through this storm event. I would agree, though, the team you have is incredible. The infrastructure and the equipment they work with is the challenge. You have incredible people on the team here. And so this just kind of helps us look at how we write the budget and where we allocate resources to the various operations. And so it's at this stage I'm going to kind of stop talking for a little bit and shift gears. And so if there is any true workshop component, this is going to be where we take some time, slow down. We'll give you all some time to think and write about either priorities or projects you would like to see. And then after you've given a little bit of time to do that, then we'll collaborate and put those up on the board. And then once we have a list, then we'll start bringing some clarity and some refinement to that. So I'm going to hand out just some blank papers for you to think and brainstorm and write on. You'll do that individually. One of the reasons why I take that approach, I always try to be mindful of group think. It's a dynamic when you have a group trying to make a decision together. And if we let Gene start, and Gene starts rolling down his list, since he got to go first, what he says will influence what Stephanie may or may not put on her paper. And so now the group decision becomes different because of group think. And so if you each individually have, we're going to give you about 5 minutes. That's not a ton of time. But think about priorities, think about things you would like to see, and you have an opportunity to think without being influenced by somebody else's comments. I think we'll capture a better summary of what is on your mind as we approach this. So we're going to hand out a couple of papers. We'll give you 5 or 10 minutes. Then we'll probably take a restroom break because I'm tired of standing here, and then we'll move on and wrap this thing up. So does that sound fair? Any questions? All right, so. And so within the category of public safety, are there any priorities that you would like our operations to focus on, or are there projects you would like to see us do in the realm of public safety, in infrastructure, administration, in finance, or community services is basically going to be parks and recreation and community development. And so in those areas, take some time, see if there are some priorities or some projects that you would like us to focus on. Let's take about 5 minutes, and if we need some more time, we can add some time from there. Show about 1 more minute. Do y'all want a little bit more time to keep thinking, or y'all feel like you're going to be wrapped up in about a minute? Okay.
Let's take a brief break before we proceed.
Mayor, Council, thank you for your patience. If there was ever a doubt, you can rest assured that I really love to talk. And so it's at this point, I'm going to try to force myself to stop talking and give you all the floor. So I think what I'd like to do, since we have Ms. Vanna White here to assist us, is that we'll just go down and focus first on public safety and give each one of you an opportunity to kind of talk about any priorities or projects that you would like us to keep in mind as we write this next budget. And so, Mayor, we will start with you. And so in the realm of public safety, were there any priorities or projects or big rocks from your point of view that you would like?
I have no big rocks in public safety.
Okay. Gene?
None.
Becky?
Well, I don't know if this is a big rock or a pebble, but increase pay so that we can retain
Okay.
officers.
All right.
Is that a big rock?
That is a big rock. Make
Work to retain police officers,
compensation.
fire personnel.
Make sure you're talking in your microphones as we go as well. Stephanie?
Do you want me to?
Oh, did you have more?
No, but I didn't have my microphone.
Okay,
on.
no, you're good.
All right, for public safety, what I would like to see is a public safety officer that their job is, well, there's a police chief, there's a fire chief
Mhm.
that reports up to the public safety officer. So that public safety officer could be looking at, reaching out to the community and making that, what is it that I want to say? Having the community be more involved in understanding what the fire and the police do and to build that relationship up.
Okay.
I'd like to see a fire chief, a police chief that would go up to a public safety officer. However we have that right now,
So-
I'm not for sure what we have.
Another
We
way to
have a-
possibly say that would be you've got the public safety director and then maybe an assistant chief or a chief over fire, an assistant chief or a chief over PD.
Correct.
So that the three of them coordinate the efforts of
Correct.
public safety.
One
Okay.
person is focused on police, one's focused on
All right.
fire, and then they work up together.
Yes.
That's your job to make it happen.
Okay. Tony?
She looked at my paper,
She cheated, so she cheated off of you? All
but
right.
I got some sand there.
Okay, all right.
Utilize or get rid of the old equipment
Okay.
that's just sitting back here stored,
Surplus equipment? Okay,
surplus equipment, and put those funds back into those departments.
sure. Anything else? No? I- I will ride on your coattails and say we want to do that for all of our departments, not just public safety. But good point. All right. Infrastructure, we're typically looking at streets, water, and sewer. Mayor, was there anything on your list?
A big one is street improvement, and followed by water and wastewater system improvements.
Okay. So are you looking for a very clear plan, or are you looking for delivered projects, or both?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right,
Both.
okay, all right.
The
Gene?
plan that can be easily explained to the citizens, and they can see where we're going and what we're gonna do, and some ideas, the magnitude of the cost that this is.
Sure, okay. Yes. Becky?
Mine was also street improvement, but I would like to see, maybe a map of where what streets we're going to be doing first, and, what process we're gonna be doing that.
Sure, okay,
The priority system.
sure.
Is a way to say that.
I'd say prioritize street projects. Stephanie?
Well, I go back to what Gene was saying is a comprehensive plan. Now, mine was more into specifically of looking at it from a 50-year plan
Mhm.
and then backing it up for every 10 years and having it reviewed every 5. But it has to be for the infrastructure that we have that the city is based on, with risk assessments in
Yeah.
there as well.
Okay.
So mine is more of a comprehensive plan with individual
Sure.
projects hitting in there.
Okay. Yeah. Tony?
I agree with everybody.
Mm-hmm. They're
Only
still
thing I'll
cheating off
say
your,
is-
they're still looking at your notes, right?
I'll just say, produce results
Mm-hmm.
for the citizens to see.
Okay, all right.
Point blank. Well, I mean. you
Deliver
showed us
results.
Black when we talked about this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we need to
Yeah.
produce.
From 2006 to 21 is
Exactly.
15 years. 15 years from now, hopefully we have a little bit more progress on that list. Yeah.
Well, the 4 years I was on council the first time, we didn't go through this.
Yeah.
We're going in the right direction.
Mayor, in terms of administration?
No big rocks on administration.
Okay. Gene?
I don't know enough to give you a good answer.
Okay.
Because of the rest of this is gonna drive.
Sure. Okay.
Nothing.
Okay.
I had nothing
Stephanie?
either.
All right. Tony?
Yes.
I'm going to hand the rest of the meeting over to Jamie because she is finance. Mayor, in terms of
Well,
finance?
mine is, it encompasses everything. It is simply to continue to increase revenue.
Yeah.
And that's economic development, that's
Yeah.
everything we do.
Yep.
But, revenue makes it work.
Right. Gene?
This is not finance, but it is. Our area of least concern was getting money from other folks moving in. And the growth in the community, the financial stability of the community will stagnate unless we have economic development.
Some new investment, some new economic, okay. New economic investment. Is that fair to say?
That's fine.
Okay. Stephanie?
I guess mine would be also to look at, we had the one thing in our bond rating was the very weak debt
Mm-hmm.
and contingency liability. Having something of a, some ideas presented to us or some goals for us to be able to be looking at how we can improve that.
Sure. Okay.
And what Stephanie just mentioned that, and I didn't in the presentation, we have some debt that's going to be paid off. Am I correct? In the next couple of years,
Mhm.
that will stabilize that
Def-
somewhat. Is that
Unless
significant?
you continue,
Right.
Adding to it, yeah.
Right.
it's a very delicate.
Balance.
Yeah.
But assuming we don't take on anything else, which I don't think that's a good assumption,
Yeah.
but if that would,
Yeah.
that would, okay.
Tony? Um, new financing options. I am not advocating that the mayor use city funds for this, but if he would start playing the lottery and win, and then name us as a recipient of his winnings, I think that would be a huge boon to our efforts.
I agree. I agree.
Tony?
Just so I can win.
Yeah.
You know, when I swore in, I didn't think I would be with people that would cheat on. It's good to know that we
Yeah.
think alike. I agree with everything. One thing, when you look at new economic investment, one thing I have battled with was A, B.
Mhm.
It's something that I've always talked about, argued about,
Mhm.
and it's something I think we need to sit down and have a serious talk about.
Yeah.
You know, from A to B, or from an A to AB.
Yeah.
There are cities in Texas our size and a little larger or a little
Mhm.
smaller that use A and B. We have to be able to allocate the money the proper way
Yeah.
to draw the businesses.
Yeah.
Let me clarify just a little bit on this broad increase in revenue. We currently, and for the past couple of years, have had a number of outside investors buy property in this town and rehab it,
Mhm.
or buy property and build something new on it.
Mhm.
I think all of us should know who those people are and let us figure out what do we do to get them to increase their investment, learn what are their plans, what
Yeah.
can we do to help them.
Yeah.
Because this is, if we get the disaster declaration again and we can
Mhm.
increase our revenue as we did this year, oh my goodness, what good things that will give us.
Right.
So I just think that's an important piece. All of us should be thinking about what do we do to encourage investment.
Yep.
And of course, Bonnie's got some good things happening that will bring us jobs and bring us taxable properties.
Yeah.
But these outsiders that are looking at this rental market as a return on investment that's a guarantee.
Yeah.
We should know them. We should encourage them. We should make sure they know of every opportunity to invest.
All right. For community services, I'm primarily looking at parks and recreation, community development, those type of programs and services that we provide. So, Mayor, did you have anything?
Had no big rocks.
Okay. Gene?
None.
Becky?
I would like to see us explore hiring our own in-house inspector, director, that there's just, maybe possibly moving away from Vera Veritas, if that is possible, and that position being somebody that could do that plus additional stuff in community.
Okay.
I do know that as we'll look at that survey, that none of us put a new employee for community development, and And I think that's probably a weak area that we have right now. So whether it is new employee, restructure, whatever. And then I would also like to, we've got to do something to build our youth sports program.
Okay. All right. Stephanie?
Well, this is a big issue for me.
Mhm.
Not as much as on the park and rec, because I'm not involved in that part as
Mhm.
much. But community development is one of the areas that I hear the most complaints about.
Okay.
And I will take that as why I would not put somebody new or come up with a new position there until we knew what is really the issue is going on, that's going on there.
Yeah.
We have investors that are coming in, and we are having investors leave because of that department.
Yep.
So we really need to, so my big rock there is, I really feel like we need to look at the processes that we have. It has to be from getting away from Veritas or retraining what we have there, come up with the processes. It's just one of those that needs to be just a start over, and let's get it right.
Agreed. Okay.
I think we need to have those developers coming in and getting their advice as to what their issues are and what we need to do about getting them
Okay.
there. So that's a big rock for me.
I agree. Okay. Tony?
I'm not gonna beat a dead horse with community development, but we feel the same. It's an area that I think we've all been recipients of complaints,
Mhm.
and it needs to be looked at. It's a big rock for me, as well as, and when you look at we look at Parks and Rec,
Mhm.
as far as personnel, we find as far as projects, I have a desire for a particular park to get, and we've talked about it.
Yeah.
That's a project to redevelop Ivermore Park.
Sure.
It's no secret that it's been left out
Mhm.
of a lot of the different plans, and it's something that we need to definitely. It's a big rock. It's
Okay.
a boulder.
Sure.
I've got another big rock that doesn't fit in there.
Okay.
I'm concerned about the communication about what's happening within the city, not just what we're responsible for, but the university, community organizations. Without a newspaper, we have very little coverage in the Greenville Herald Banner. And I
Mhm.
understand that, and I understand that the trials and tribulations of all the newspapers at this time. But the internal communication and spreading of the news is very hit and miss.
Yeah.
And I don't have an answer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts or additions that y'all would like to add to this list? Before we flip the board over, because we're going to flip the board over and look at some of what y'all talked about in a meeting somewhat similar to this in recent past, I feel like it would be important for me to say, if I had to pick one strategic thing for us to really, really focus on in the coming year, to me, honestly, it would not be streets. It honestly would not even be water and wastewater infrastructure. If I had to focus on one issue, it would be community development. Because of what you hit on and what many of you talked about, water infrastructure is expensive. and it requires resources and the ability to get resources to make those infrastructure investments. Streets are expensive, and it requires a resource base underneath the community to help fund and finance those projects that need to happen. And if we don't see investment and development within our community, we're not going to regrow the base of resources that we have to use to fix these infrastructure problems. And in the 4 months I've been here, I've had 3 different developers tell me personally they would never do a project in Commerce again. We've got to turn that around, and we've got to make it easy for developers to work here, and we've got to make it easy for them to get a return on their investment. Some very practical rubber meets the road concepts. Jamie and Molly and I even had part of this conversation today. If you look at the market and where the market wants to invest in our community, they want to invest in rental property. That's what the market wants to do. The city currently has a policy that if you have an existing single-family structure, it only gets 1 water meter. And so if you've got an old, dilapidated structure that an investor wants to buy and renovate, their return on investment is better if they can create a duplex or create some kind of situation there. We have a policy that prevents that. We have a policy that doesn't incentivize that investment in a neighborhood that already has duplexes, that already has that kind of stuff happening. And so we're looking at some of our policies and making changes so that it is convenient to investors that want to invest money in our community and can't because of the very policies that we are following. And so we're looking at some very real things like that that impact the ability of developers to invest money and then get a return on their investment.
Honey, I would like to add one thing to that, and I think, I mean, it all kind of follows under the same thing, but we had, in our code enforcement
Right.
and our BSC, that program was going very, very strongly. I know we did the easy demos, you know, the vacant buildings and everything, and that is the easy part.
Yeah.
I realize we've had an employee that's been out for about 7 months, so of course things are going to slow down. But we need not to let up the accelerator on that, because that frees up the property, it cleans up our town, and that's
Agreed
something that
completely.
I'd like to see.
Yeah.
I know we've been shorthanded, but if we can get that going again.
Commerce needs to be a very easy place for commerce to happen.
Yes.
And we're not
Well,
always easy.
Right.
So,
We tend to beat on Bureau Veritas, trying to enforce the rules that we adopted years ago and have not looked at in
Yeah.
a decade or two.
Agreed.
Therefore,
Yeah.
I don't see this as an impossibility to do this along with many other things.
Yeah.
It's just we as a council don't really know what rules we ask Bureau Veritas to enforce. Some of them are ridiculous.
in 2
they are.
weeks,
They are
But that's their
ridiculous.
fault. It's
And-
not
Well,
theirs.
and that's
Agreed.
that's the part. We have to get in there, and that's what I was saying. We've got to get from the square one, find
Sure.
out what it is that we really need. When we're coming in, we're having all these people that are going to be coming in for rental property.
Yeah.
Back on the code enforcement portion of it, we need to make sure that we are enforcing that they follow the rules and that we keep that property up. The only way we can do that is by enforcing the others that are currently here and showing that we are doing it.
Agreed.
Because that's another thing that comes up is you're expecting me to do these things, but right next door,
Yeah.
I'm not having this.
Yeah.
Again,
think
it's
some-
just a whole that whole section just needs to be
And
rethought.
some of those are common sense things
Yeah.
that, they're going by their guidelines, but it's not common sense in commerce, just because we've adopted the 2012, I guess, or is it 2012?
We're under the 2012 codes, but we have a
Right.
local amendment that was recommended by the Council of Governments in the Metroplex, which were amendments that may work in the Metroplex, but they're not
right.
necessarily amendments that work in
And-
rural
and
Commerce
again,
America.
That is just
No.
the whole community development, but I did want to bring that up, that
No.
we need to get that program back
Agreed.
to the code enforcement.
Agree completely. All right. All right, so. All right, we're on the downhill slope. I just want to talk through some of the key dates that are in front of us as we continue to go through this budgetary process. Today on March 2nd, we had the kickoff workshop. On April 20th at that city council meeting, that is one of the milestones where we put together the hot fund applications and send them out to the local agencies that rely on hot funds for some of their operations. May 18th will be a presentation of those applicants that are asking for hot funds as part of their operations. June 15th will actually be the point where some decisions are made about how to allocate those hot funds, hotel occupancy tax, hot funds. And so those are 3 dates that include you all and your input during this process. On July 16th, we're required to submit a balanced city manager's budget proposal. So that will be made available to you on July the 16th. And you'll have some time to digest and review and analyze the budget that is presented to you all. I do think it's important to note, I'm not necessarily going to pick on state government, but sometimes state government has absolutely incredible ideas, and they change the calendar in which cities adopt their budgets and adopt their tax rates. And so we have deadlines that we have to meet that are before we even have a certified tax roll. So I have to give you a balanced budget on July the 16th, and I don't get a certified tax roll until July the 25th. And so we're going to give you a balanced budget, but there may be some change that have to make to that budget because we get the certified tax roll after the fact. Just an interesting little quirk. But one of the things I need you to mark on your calendars is August 2nd and 3rd. We're going to hold those dates for another council workshop. And so it is our intention to deliver to you on July 16th our proposed budget, and then give you a couple of weeks to digest and look and analyze so that when we have our meeting on August the 2nd, you have had time to make some informed decisions and some informed questions about the budget that has been presented. If we need to roll into the 3rd, we're holding that date as well so that we can have those workshops to give you the opportunity to bring to our attention your questions, allow us to answer those questions. And so that is a key milestone in this budget process. How we move forward from there, again, thanks to our lovely state government, it depends on whether we have to have an election for the tax rate. I'm not going to get into all of the new terminology, but if we have a budget that council feels they want to adopt that requires an election for the tax rate, then there is a calendar we have to follow. And so that would be, remember your workshop on August 2nd and 3rd. We would have to follow that up on August 16th with a special meeting that has public hearings regarding the proposed budget, the proposed tax rate, and then you have to call an election for November. We have to have a second meeting on August the 23rd that is another public hearing about the proposed tax rate and moving everything towards the general election date of November 2nd. Should you have a budget that you want to adopt that does not require an election, then you have your workshop on August the 2nd. between August 3rd and September 20th, you can have as many meetings, you can have whatever you want to do to talk about the budget, but we have until September 21st to have a meeting with a public hearing about the budget and the tax rate. And so if we have a budget that does not require an election, the schedule is much more relaxed. It doesn't have as many milestones to follow, and you've got until September 21st to actually adopt the budget and adopt the tax rate. And so those are some of the dates in front of us.
And I just want you to be aware that if a tax rate that requires an election is the route you choose to go, you will adopt a budget for October 1st, but the election for the property tax rate is not until November. So just keep that in mind, and a part of the new law is that if you reach your, over your effective or over your 8%, it's an automatic election. You don't have to wait for somebody to petition for election, it's automatic. So those are two kind of things that are new, and main reason as to why we would have to give you a budget so like 2 weeks earlier than normal is because if you chose to go with a rate that needs election, not because I want to do one 2 weeks earlier.
And should we adopt a budget that requires an election and that election fail, then it automatically reverts back to a set tax rate, and then we have to adjust all of our budgets, and we'll be prepared for that should the need arise. So
Have you gotten any wind of what discussions are happening in Austin in this legislature to possibly make it harder for us to increase revenue?
I haven't heard any specific discussions, but the trend seems to continue along the route of making it harder for local governments to manage their revenues and their resources.
Well, a tax increase election is, I hope, avoidable. Again, increased property values gives us a bonanza if we can maintain what we did this last time, and without increasing the tax rate, which is already pretty steep.
It is my goal to bring you in July a balanced budget that does not require a tax election. But when I give you that budget, there will also be kind of a menu of options that y'all can take a look at and say, if we want to add these things to the budget, then this is where it would push us into, so that you can clearly identify what are the compelling things that pushes our budget in that direction. But it is our goal to bring you a budget that does not require an increase which triggers an election. All right, so in summary, I think it's very important that we move forward, and we move forward quickly with a comprehensive plan so that we have, you don't throw money at problems, you create a plan to address problems. And we don't want to adopt a budget in a vacuum and not have it tied to a bigger picture. I think we have in front of us some financial goals that your staff wants to be able to provide and meet. One of those is a budget that doesn't require a tax increase or an election. And then we also want to bring you a budget that addresses some of the priorities, in that within the budget we write, you can see action and movement on these areas. But ultimately, and I think you said it earlier, so I cheated and read off your page as well, it is our job to deliver results. One of the things that I tell staff frequently, there's a lot of things that I tell staff frequently, and at some point, they've started regurgitating it back to me, so I think I'm getting through. Whenever I do this, they know exactly what's coming. The single most important thing we do as managers is deliver results. There is nothing more important than delivering results to our community. And if we cannot deliver results, they need to get different managers. I then flip the coin over and I tell the staff the single most important thing we do as managers is recruit and retain good people. Because if you don't have good people, you can't make it through a problem like we just made it through with our water situations. And those two priorities can be at odds with each other. If you're entirely focused on results and you don't care about the people, you'll get results for a very short period of time and then it falls apart. If all of your focus is recruiting and retaining good people and making them happy, then you never push them to deliver results, and everybody's happy and nobody does anything. And so we have to balance that competing interest, but ultimately we have to deliver results. And the community's confidence in us and they're willing to entrust us with their money and their resources all ties to our ability to deliver results. And how we budget and how we actually act and behave derives to that point of delivering results. And so with that, I will conclude the presentation. If there are any final questions, Jamie's going to answer them all. And then for kicks and grins, if anybody wants to, we'll flip the board over and look at some of the points and some of the priorities that y'all mentioned. There are a number of them that we've been able to check off. There are a number of them that are actually in process and we're moving on right now. And then there's some of them that still require some focus and attention. But Mayor, we'll give you back the time. The meeting is yours.
Are there any other comments or questions related to anything we've discussed tonight? If not, at 8:05, this meeting is adjourned.